Now, points of structure and form, I think, are present, but not necessarily that wide-ranging in this particular extract. I think the fact that we have one single coherent dramatic monologue tells us that I think this type of thinking that Macbeth is articulating in this dramatic monologue is about order. It's about retaining the social order, and we have a fairly rigid adherence to iambic pentameter throughout, and a really a single flowing sense of argument really that takes us through these three stages. Importantly, I think, is the hesitancy and the violence involved in this opening section of the alliteration that we see. Cease, success, blow, be all and end all. Those plosives, I think, are quite suggestive of the violence that's going to take place. But then in the final section, there's a really interesting kind of structural feature that looks like persuasive writing. And this is an important feature of Macbeth convincing himself. He proposes this point. He's here in double trust. He's talking about Duncan's role, being a guest in his castle. And what he ends up doing here is using some of the structure of persuasive writing. He uses discourse markers. First this, then as his host, besides. Here, these words, first, then, besides, are showing us that he is progressing through a logical course of argumentation. And that is what we see in this final section. He's arguing with himself about the morality of the action that he's plotting. And so he's convincing himself out of that wicked action in that final section, which we see through some of these discourse markers. Also, he says, besides, this Duncan hath borne his faculties so meek, hath been so clear in his great office. This repetition of a phrase or a word at the beginning of a clause or a sentence is called anaphora, and it gives us an emphatic sense of Macbeth's praise of Duncan here. He's convincing himself to not do these things. He's convincing himself to change his course of action. Again, there's an interesting use of syntax as well here. He says, then as his host who should against his murderer shut the door. The normal syntax would be who should shut the door against his murderer. There's this sense of, with this phrase at the front of this particular part of the sentence, it emphasizes the opposite of his plans. That it is not against his murderer that he's shutting the door, but he is becoming his murderer. And so that transformation of the syntax, which is part of the structure of the piece, again, gives us a sense of his moral, what's called prevarication, his switching from decision to decision and being undecided about what he ought to do. Finally, there is some dental alliteration that I think shows us perhaps the communicative power of Duncan's virtues. He said that his virtues will plead like angels, trumpet-tongued against the deep damnation of his taking off. Trumpet-tongued and taking, and then deep damnation. Those examples of both what's called dental alliteration, are giving us a sense of the communicative power of Duncan's virtues as a king. That his virtues are going to communicate really powerfully and widely across the land in a way that's going to undermine Macbeth were he even to commit this sort of murderous act and become king himself. Duncan is such a good king that his virtues are going to have power over the future in a way that undermines him and makes him weak.